A black man stands on his driveway, not yelling, not resisting, and just standing, with the stillness born from a lifetime of being told to step aside. But today, he doesn't. Because somewhere between the stairs, the silence, and the stolen space, he remembers his father's voice. Don't ever let them make you small. This is more than a driveway. This is a line that won't be crossed again. She parked in his driveway as if she were entitled to it. No permission, no apology. Just an assumption, the kind that's been protected for generations. But this wasn't just any man. Bayani Carter had seen this before. Not the car, the mindset. He was 48, a history teacher, and black. He'd been pulled over for driving through the wrong neighborhood. He knew how fast things escalated when a man like him raised his voice. So he didn't, not yet. He watched. He waited. And when patience finally ran dry, he didn't shout. He acted. What followed wasn't just a towed Lexus. It was a slow unraveling of power, privilege, and perception on a suburban street where one man quietly said, "Enough." This isn't a story about a parking spot. It's about how legal, moral, and racial lines get crossed, and how reclaiming something small can change everything. She parked in his driveway as if she had inherited the deed, as if his presence was temporary and her convenience was permanent. It wasn't just a car. It was a message, one that had echoed for generations in America, sometimes whispered, sometimes screamed. This space is mine. Yours is borrowed. Bayani Carter knew that message. He had heard it before, though not always in words. He heard it when a store clerk followed him down an aisle pretending to straighten shelves. He felt it in the long pause of a neighbor's wave that never came. He lived it the day he was pulled over for driving through the wrong neighborhood in his city. No ticket, no warning. This question carried centuries of implication. Do you live around here? This wasn't about asphalt and concrete. This was about history and hierarchy, the kind that is invisible, the kind that tells a black man in America that ownership is conditional, that dignity must be proven, and that space is never just physical. It is social, it is political, it is personal. Karen Ashford's Lexus in his driveway was not just an inconvenience. It was an invasion, a daily reenactment of the same quiet violence black Americans have experienced in schools, at jobs, and on sidewalks. It was the unspoken belief that her presence mattered more than his, that she could take up space without asking, while he had spent decades learning how to ask without appearing threatening. Bayani didn't confront her the first time, or the second. He knew how easily irritation could be mistaken for aggression from someone like him. He had spent his life mastering restraint, not because he was weak, but wise. The stakes were never the same. For some, raising your voice earned respect. For him, it invited risk. So he watched. He waited. But every time she parked there, it chipped away at something fundamental. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was something more profound, a sense of rightful belonging, of earned peace. The basic human need is to be left unbothered in your own home. America promises liberty and justice for all, but reality is often measured in moments like these: a stolen parking space, a withheld apology, a neighbor's assumption. What Karen did with her car, the country has done with its power. Taking space without asking, expecting silence in return. But silence is not the same as consent, and dignity is not passive. Bayani Carter made a choice, not to escalate, but to assert, to draw a line not in chalk, but in conviction. He didn't shout. He dialed. He didn't threaten. He acted. The tow truck that came wasn't just lifting Alexis. It was lifting a weight he'd carried for years, the weight of always having to yield. Some will say it was just a parking dispute. They'll call it petty, overblown. But that's because they've never had to measure their manhood in how calmly they absorbed disrespect. They've never had to teach their sons to be invisible enough to survive, but visible enough not to disappear. Bayani didn't want revenge. He wanted respect. He wasn't claiming superiority. He was reclaiming equality. And in doing so, he reminded all who watched that the fight for dignity doesn't always arrive with marches or megaphones. Sometimes it comes with a tow truck. Sometimes it starts with a quiet man who finally says, "Not this time." Because in America, the battle over who belongs is rarely about property lines. It's about power lines, unseen but deeply felt. And when a man like Bayani dares to hold his ground, he's not just defending a driveway. He's protecting the future of standing tall, being counted, and existing without explanation. He remembered the stories passed down from his grandfather, a railroad worker who was once fired for asking to be called by his full name. He remembered his father, who taught him to keep his hands visible when stopped by police and always to say, "Sir." And now he found himself echoing those same survival lessons to his teenage son, who had already learned that wearing a hoodie in the wrong place could be a death sentence. So when Karen parked her car in his driveway, it wasn't just a Lexus. It was a legacy, a continuation of the casual entitlement that told Bayani, again and again, that his presence was tolerated, not respected. And this time, he had a choice, a quiet act of resistance, a refusal to make space for someone who wouldn't even acknowledge his right to have it. Not your driveway, Karen. Not anymore. Bayani Carter had always known that patience was more than a virtue. For a black man in America, it was armor. It was how you survived traffic stops with your dignity intact. How did you hold a job without being labeled difficult? You raised your voice just enough to be heard, but never enough to be feared. He wore patience the way others wore privilege, constantly and without choice. But patience is not passivity, and silence, when misread, becomes permission. Karen Ashford misunderstood both. For weeks, she parked in Bayani's driveway like it belonged to her. She smiled as if her presence was a gift. She waved dismissively, like her convenience outweighed his discomfort. And through it all, Bayani said nothing. Not because he accepted it, but because he was measuring, not just disrespect, but also risk. In another life, Bayani might have knocked on her door, her voice steady and her demand clear. But life had taught him the sharp edges of being assertive while black. He remembered a colleague reprimanded for being aggressive after stating a boundary. He remembered being 25, standing beside his first car on the side of a suburban road, hands raised while an officer circled slowly, asking the same question in 5 different ways. "What are you doing here?" He was tired of explaining his presence. So he waited, and watched, and counted, until the day her Lexus completely blocked his garage. Bayani didn't rage. He didn't shout. He made a phone call. The tow truck arrived in under 20 minutes. The driver looked at Bayani, the car, and the deed in his hand. It was simple, routine, and legal, but nothing about it felt small. When the Lexus lifted into the air, Bayani felt something he hadn't in years, weightless. Karen returned furious, her entitlement bruised. She knocked on his door like she owned the hinges, accused him, threatened him, reminded him of her position on the HOA board, of her connections, of her expectations. Bayani listened, not because he was intimidated, but because he'd learned that letting people speak often revealed more than interrupting them. Then he closed the door. The fallout came quickly. Flyers accusing him of being hostile, petty letters about trash cans and porch plants, and security calling for suspicious activity whenever he watered his lawn. But Bayani did not bend. He documented, prepared, and endured. And then he pushed back. At the HOA meeting, he arrived early with a folder in hand. He spoke clearly, backed by evidence. But more than that, he talked with history behind him. His history, his father's history, his grandfather's history. He told them what this was, not a parking issue, but a pattern of assumption, erasure, and inherited entitlement, met with forced silence. Neighbors listened, some uncomfortably, some nodding. And when the votes were counted, Karen was removed from the board. But Bayani didn't celebrate. He wasn't looking for victory. He was looking for space. The kind not measured in square feet, but in respect. He watered his lawn that night without incident, a small thing. But when you've been watched for years, unobserved peace feels revolutionary. Later that week, a young boy from the neighborhood rode past on his bike, paused, and called out, "Mr. Carter, my mom says thank you. She never liked how she talked to you." Bayani nodded, words catching in his throat. Because resistance doesn't always look like a march, and dignity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly on a porch, refusing to move. Not this time. Not anymore. Not your driveway. Bayani Carter didn't wake up one morning deciding to make a statement. He didn't seek confrontation. He wasn't fueled by pride or vengeance. He wanted simple, to come home from work, pull into his driveway, and not find someone else claiming his space. It shouldn't have been too much to ask. But for people like Bayani, nothing is ever simple. Every small act of self-preservation risks being read as provocation, and every boundary he drew had to be weighed against how it might be perceived. Karen Ashford was the kind of neighbor who interpreted kindness as weakness and silence as permission. So when she parked in his driveway again, after the first tow, after the HOA meeting, after every possible warning, Bayani knew this was no longer about parking. It was about principle. Not just his, but the principle his father had whispered into his ear decades earlier. Never let anyone make you small in your own house. That day, Bayani came home to find Karen's Lexus parked intentionally, blocking the garage, centered perfectly as if making a statement. He sat in his car, stared through the windshield, and heard loud silence humming in his chest. Then he stepped out, unfolded his lawn chair, and called the tow truck. This time, he didn't even walk to her door. There was nothing left to say. 15 minutes later, the truck rolled in, efficient and unapologetic. As the metal arms wrapped around the tires, Karen came flying out of her front door, barefoot, enraged, and sure of her superiority. "You called them again? Are you insane? I had guests. There was nowhere else to park." Bayani didn't flinch. He didn't even rise. "You don't live here," he said evenly. "You don't get to take this from me." She yelled louder, threatened lawsuits, screamed about character and community, and how he was making the neighborhood hostile. Bayani watched her spiral, calmly, like someone who had finally put down a burden he'd carried far too long. Karen turned and stormed inside as the tow truck pulled away with the Lexus. The silence she left behind was louder than her tantrum. But what mattered most wasn't her departure. It was what happened afterward. Later that evening, an elderly neighbor, Mr. Delgado, came by with a beer in one hand and a folding chair in the other. He sat beside Bayani on the porch and said, "Took guts. She did the same to my daughter last year. We just let it go. Bayani nodded. I almost did. Well, Delgado sighed, not anymore. That moment opened something. Over the next week, people stopped by, quietly, casually, to talk, to thank him, not because they loved drama, but because someone had finally drawn a line and held it. Bayani had become the man who reminded the neighborhood what dignity looked like when it stood its ground. But the victory wasn't just personal. It was generational. Bayani thought of his son, Malik, 16, lanky, still learning to be visible in a world that often tried to shrink him. When Malik asked why the car was gone, Bayani didn't say it was about rules. He said, "Because I wanted you to see that we don't always have to make ourselves small to stay safe." Malik nodded slowly. That was enough. The next day, Bayani bought a new welcome mat, not because he needed one, but because symbols mattered. He trimmed the hedges, repainted the mailbox, and felt the house breathe for the first time in months. Karen. She didn't park there again. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. But Bayani didn't watch her move out. He had other things to do. A life to live. A space that, finally, was entirely his. Sometimes, taking your place in the world doesn't require a crowd. Sometimes, it just needs a chair, a phone call, and the unshakable belief that you deserve better. And Bayani Carter did. Because respect isn't given by neighbors who wave, it's claimed by men who refuse to be moved. Not this time. Not anymore. Not your driveway. The thing about privilege is that it rarely leaves quietly. It doesn't bow out when it's challenged. It bites back. And Karen Ashford? She wouldn't make an exception just because she'd been caught. After her Lexus was towed for the second time, after the HOA meeting stripped her of the power she used like a shield, she could have stopped. She could have reflected. But she didn't. She retaliated. Bayani Carter had seen this pattern before, not just among neighbors, but also in boardrooms, schools, and on sidewalks. When people like Karen get told no, they don't hear a boundary. They hear betrayal. And betrayal, to them, demands revenge. It started subtly. Flyers were taped to every mailbox on the block. Is this the community we want? Neighbors towing cars instead of having conversations? There were no names, but everyone knew who they were aimed at. Then came the HOA complaints, one after another. His hedges weren't trimmed evenly. His porch light was too bright. The mailbox paint was not up to standard. The same porch, plants, and paint that had been there for years without issue were suddenly problems. Bayani didn't flinch. He documented everything, responded formally, factually. That's what years of navigating bureaucracy had taught him. Never react with heat, always with record. But then, Karen escalated. Just before sunset, Bayani was watering his garden one evening when a white security SUV pulled up with lights flashing. A tall officer stepped out, adjusted his belt, and said, "We got a report of suspicious activity." Bayani didn't have to guess who called. He turned slowly, eyes locking with Karen standing smugly on her porch, arms folded like she had just won something. "Do you live here, sir?" the officer asked. Bayani took a breath. "Yes, 15 years, longer than she has." The officer's eyes flicked toward Karen, then down at the watering hose in Bayani's hand. "Just checking, sir." "No, you weren't." The SUV rolled away. Karen didn't move. And Bayani? He didn't go inside. He stood still, long enough for her to feel the weight of his presence. Later that evening, he walked to her porch and knocked on the door. Once. Karen answered with that trademark smirk. Security stopped by. "Everything okay?" she said, as if she hadn't summoned them. Bayani looked her dead in the eye. Not angry, just resolved. "You're not upset about a driveway, Karen. You're upset I didn't bow. That someone like me doesn't shrink when someone like you feels inconvenienced." She opened her mouth to argue. He raised his hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere. File every complaint you want. Call security every day. It won't change a thing. You're just going to have to get used to seeing me. Peaceful. Unbothered. Still here." He turned and walked back across the lawn she hated so much. Not because it was messy, but because it wasn't hers. And she did try again. An anonymous note complaining about aesthetic uniformity violations because of his wind chimes. A report was filed about noise from his nephew's birthday party, but Bayani stayed the course. He replied, documented, quiet, steady. This wasn't about winning a battle, but denying a bully the power to shape the story. But something else started to shift. The neighborhood noticed. Mr. Delgado, who barely spoke English, began waving every morning. The Johnsons repainted their mailbox in bright, cheerful colors. A small group of teens from the block dropped off a handmade sign. "We stand with Mr. Carter." Bayani didn't post about it. He didn't turn it into a spectacle. He just placed the sign by the edge of his yard, under the mailbox Karen had complained about. Resistance doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears gardening gloves. And privilege? It doesn't know what to do when its tantrums no longer get applause. For the first time, Karen looked out from her window and didn't see a man who could be pushed. She saw a neighbor who had become undeniable. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. He was present. And that presence was power. Not your rules, not your game, not your driveway, not anymore. One Sunday morning, Bayani found a letter slipped through his door. No name, just a handwritten note. "Thank you. I wish I had your courage. I let her talk down to my daughter and said nothing. But seeing you stand tall gave us all permission." He read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in his desk drawer. A reminder that even quiet resistance echoes. At church the following weekend, the pastor used the story, without naming names, as a metaphor for moral courage. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't need to shout. You need to stand. And when you do, others will find the strength to stand beside you." Karen's house went up for sale by the end of the month. The flyer described it as a peaceful neighborhood. Bayani smiled. For once, it finally was. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to lead a movement. He was trying to live in peace. But sometimes, living in peace is the most powerful rebellion of all. For years, Bayani Carter walked his neighborhood like a careful guest in his home, polite, soft-spoken, always deferential. He waved when waved to, smiled when smiled at, kept his tone measured, and his presence small. That was how you survived as a black man in a suburban Florida neighborhood built on rules, both written and unspoken. But now everything had changed. It wasn't that Bayani had transformed. It was that his quiet refusal to be erased had stirred something buried in the hearts of his neighbors. Something raw. Something waiting. After Karen Ashford's efforts to humiliate him failed, after the petty flyers, the fabricated complaints, and the hollow security calls crumbled under their absurdity, Bayani had become something new, a mirror. And when people saw him, they began to see themselves. It began with a knock. Mr. Thompson, a Vietnam veteran who had lived across the street for 27 years without saying a word, arrived with cornbread and a nod. "You did what most of us never dared," he said. "I let her boss my wife around for a decade. You made it stop." Then came the kids. A group of teens repainted the benches at the community park, which Karen had complained were too loud in color. They made them louder. Neon, glittered, defiant. Every brushstroke was a protest wrapped in joy. Bayani watched from his porch, in the same chair, in the same calm. But inside, something swelled. Not pride, not victory. Something quieter, healing. He wasn't trying to lead, but somehow his stillness had created movement. Mrs. Lee, a retired school teacher who'd kept to herself since her husband died, stopped by with fresh dumplings. "Karen told me my garden was a fire hazard," she confessed, eyes lowered. "I cut it all down. I didn't say a word." She paused. "I should have. But now, I'm planting again." Bayani listened, nodded. He knew the weight of swallowed words, of dignity traded for quiet. The next HOA meeting felt different. No one yelled, no one grandstanded, but the energy had shifted. Neighbors who had once looked down now looked across. Mr. Delgado wondered why specific households received more HOA notices than others, and Mrs. Patel wondered why only some residents were ever accused of being unneighborly. Karen sat at the end of the table, arms crossed, lips pressed into silence. For once, she wasn't the one controlling the room. Her silence was no longer powerful. It was a retreat. Later that week, a young journalist came knocking. She'd heard the story. A black man who refused to shrink, a white woman who tried to make him disappear, and a neighborhood that finally saw itself. "Will you let me write about you?" she asked. Bayani looked at her kindly. "You can write about the neighborhood, but don't make it about me. This isn't one man's stand. It's a neighborhood waking up." Instead, he invited her to a new initiative, monthly community cleanup days. No signs, no speeches, just people, gloves, tools, laughter, neighbors becoming neighbors. The first event drew dozens. Children, elders, newcomers. They shared lemonade and stories. Some apologized. Others just worked beside him silently. It was enough. That night, Malik, Bayani's 16-year-old son, sat beside him on the porch, knees bouncing with unspoken thought. "Dad," he said, "at school, they say people like us should keep our heads down. But you didn't." Bayani exhaled. "It's not about being loud, son. It's about standing when it matters. Quiet can be strong too. You don't have to shrink to stay safe." Malik nodded, eyes wide, hope blooming behind them. Days passed. The neighborhood didn't just recover, it grew. Mr. Johnson, who had once avoided Bayani, now brought paint to help retouch the fence. The Rodriguez family planted trees in the shared green space. Kids left chalk drawings outside Bayani's driveway with messages like, "Thanks, Mr. Carter," and "Our hero has a garden hose." He chuckled softly at that one. One Sunday, a small envelope appeared under his door. Inside, a note read, "Thank you for not leaving. Thank you for not yelling. You gave us our voice." There was no signature. There was no need. The next HOA election came and went. Karen didn't run. Her house, once the nucleus of command, fell quiet. A for sale sign appeared weeks later. No one asked why. Bayani didn't watch her leave. He didn't need to. His energy wasn't focused behind him. It was in the present, in the laughter of new barbecues, the bright colors of repainted mailboxes, the unspoken relief of a block exhaling at last. Because not all revolutions happen in city squares. Some start on porches, in garden beds, in the silence between accusations and action. Bayani didn't raise his voice. He simply didn't back down. And that changed everything. Not your narrative, not your silence, not your neighborhood, not anymore. Bayani Carter didn't want to be remembered as the man who had a neighbor's car towed. He hoped, if people remembered anything, it would be the stillness with which he stood his ground, the integrity that carried him through a storm not of his making, the way he chose to resolve his rage. But sometimes the smallest acts become the loudest echoes. Months after Karen's departure, the neighborhood had found a new rhythm. There were no more security calls over garden hoses, no more HOA letters about mailbox paint. The silence wasn't empty, it was earned. Bayani's front yard had transformed, not just physically, but symbolically. What was once a battleground of power had become a gathering space. Teenagers helped him build a small lending library by the sidewalk. Children biked past and waved. On Sunday afternoons, neighbors stopped to talk, not about conflict, but about life. One evening, Malik returned home from school carrying a history project. "We were supposed to write about leaders," he said, placing the paper on the table. "I wrote about you." Bayani blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" Malik nodded. "You didn't march, you didn't give speeches, but you made people listen anyway." He handed over the paper. The title read, "The Man Who Stayed." Bayani sat silently, the words soaking in like rain on parched soil. It was never about the driveway. Not really. It was about teaching a community how to stand tall without stepping on anyone. It was about showing his son, and the sons and daughters watching silently from their windows, that boundaries can be set with dignity and respect. That power doesn't have to roar to be real. Weeks later, Bayani was invited to speak at a local high school. He hesitated at first. He wasn't a public speaker. He didn't feel like a role model. But Malik encouraged him. "Just tell them the truth," he said. "That's what changed everything." So Bayani stood before a classroom of wide-eyed students. They were mostly kids of color, some first generation, and some whose parents had warned them, like his once did, to keep their hands visible and their voices low. He didn't lecture. He told a story about patience, about restraint, about the moment you realize silence is no longer safety, but surrender. When he finished, a girl in the back row raised her hand. "Do you think it's worth it? Standing up when the world doesn't want to hear you?" Bayani smiled. "I think," he said, "sometimes the world pretends not to hear you because it fears what you'll say. But when you speak, not just with words, but with action, you permit others to speak too. That's how change begins. Quietly. Then, all at once." The room was still, not silent, just listening. That night, Bayani sat on his porch again. Same chair, same breeze. But everything was different. A child walked past holding her mother's hand and waved. The woman smiled. A new family. Karen's house had sold. Bayani didn't care who moved in. He only hoped they brought peace, not performance. He looked at the mailbox, newly painted, still standing. At the grass, where chalk drawings had once spelled his name. At the sky, where dusk turned gold. He had held his ground, and because he did, others found theirs. Not a headline, not a hashtag, but a legacy. And legacies, they don't always start in parades. Sometimes they begin on a driveway, And they last far, far beyond it. Some stories don't end. They echo. Bayani Carter didn't win by fighting. He won by enduring, by choosing stillness over spectacle, grace over grudges. And in doing so, he showed us something we often forget in a world addicted to noise. You can shift an entire community just by refusing to move. He didn't need an audience. He didn't need applause. All he needed was a line in the sand, a porch to stand on, and the quiet conviction that dignity is not something anyone gives you. It's something you claim and protect every day. Karen. She wasn't the villain. She was the lesson. This is a warning about what happens when privilege goes unchecked, when silence from well-meaning people becomes a tacit permission for bad behavior. She tried to erase him, and instead erased herself. So, if this story stayed with you, if you felt that lump in your throat, that sting of recognition, that breath of hope, you're not alone. We tell these stories for you, for all of us, because maybe, just maybe, you've been Bayani, or you've needed someone like him to remind you that you matter, that your presence matters, that your boundaries are sacred. Let this story stay with you. Let it change how you show up in your life. And if it did something to your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Could you share it? Comment below. Tell us what part of this story cracked something open in you. And subscribe to the channel because there are more voices to honor, more truths to hold, and more quiet revolutions waiting to be told. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. May your day be full of quiet power and your spirit be anchored like Bayani's, unmoved, unshaken, and unforgettable.